Shadiversity.
Greetings, I'm Shad. And you know, the first fantasy castles I reviewed on this channel for their realism and practicality were the castles from Game of Thrones. And up to this point in time, that video has had over 1 million views, which is just phenomenal. But there was a difficulty I had in that there wasn't many good detailed shots of the castles I was looking at, which is why I reviewed several of the castles to the best of my ability, and I wasn't able to do a real deep dive on any of them. But now, with Game of Thrones really completed, especially with the last season, we have been given a far more detailed look at Winterfell. And so because of that, I now have the opportunity to do an in-depth analysis of Winterfell, looking at as much as possible for how effective a castle design it really is, as well as its historical accuracy. The first thing that I should mention is that the overall design and layout of Winterfell has changed based on, I guess, season and also the interpretation. For instance, there is a model that you can buy of Winterfell that is quite different from the version we see in the show. And then the layout and version of Winterfell in the show itself also changes. So which one am I going to review? Well, I'm going to review the one from Season 8, the most complete version of it. The one that's represented in the Great Battle of Winterfell, the Long Night, and it's the one that they fully modeled in 3D. So to start us off, I will make some broader observations about the overall aesthetic and design style. I like the design of the Merlons in the way that they are kind of jagged and stepped up. I like that they went with the design of them being sloped on the outside. And as I mentioned in my previous video, I really like that they have wooden hoardings atop some of their battlements. A wooden hoarding is a wooden type of battlement built on top of a stone structure, which gives the archers a platform to step out a little bit beyond the line of the wall beneath. This was architecturally included in stone castle designs as one of my favorite, medieval castle design features. Headphone warning. Matriculations! And interestingly enough, we actually do see matriculations on Winterfell, but I have a bit more to say regarding these matriculations that I'll address a little bit later in this video. My main criticism of the design of Winterfell, as I was able to observe in my previous video, was the line of the roof, specifically its angle. As I addressed in my dedicated video on why castle rooflines sometimes have a secondary angle, one of the reasons why medieval rooflines were so steep, not the only reason, but one, was so that snow would slide off the edges. And I found it really odd that Winterfell had such low rooflines on many of its towers. Now that we can see the castle from above, we actually see that many of these towers are open on the inside. Though the problem that I addressed still exists on some of these side towers, because they still have pretty low roof lines. It wouldn't be nearly as a problem with these roof lines that are open to kind of like a flat tower rampart in the middle. Now, if it's a stone floor atop these towers, that means that there would have to be a vaulted ceiling underneath, and that is definitely strong enough to support quite a lot of weight. If it's a timber floor, well, build up a stone would be a big problem, but you have direct access to this floor because it is a floor, so you just have to clean it off regularly. This would just be one of those annoying tasks, which honestly would have existed in medieval times, not necessarily for the roofs, but for the ramparts and any area that you want to walk. You need to clean off the snow. Heck, shoveling snow to clear out your driveway in areas with high snow is a problem even in the modern day. But getting access to the roofs of these other buildings and towers would be quite the annoying task and make it more difficult. It would have made so much more sense to have steeper roof lines on every single building we see in Winterfell. Overall, I'm glad that they have kept a mostly consistent aesthetic style. So where there is crenellations, we see that same style of crenellations. We see it on these smaller towers around the woodland here. We see it on the larger gatehouses and the internal towers as well. Zooming out to the bird's eye view of Winterfell, one of the largest issues I see here is the lack of a moat. This is on very flat land, which would make a moat an absolute necessity, an essential feature. If any medieval architect saw this castle design, I reckon they would just react kind of the same way I'm reacting. It's like, where's the moat? Such a defensive weakness and blunder, it's mind-boggling. Now, I know that they add a ditch in later on, but that ditch is not a proper moat. You want a moat to be as close to those castle walls as possible, which essentially increases the height of the castle wall without you needing to actually build more of it from stone. And it doesn't need to be filled with water if you're thinking, well, the moat would just freeze over. A moat is not defining a water-filled kind of river around a castle. A moat is defined by a large ditch that can or might not be filled with water. The water component is not an essential part with the definition of what a moat is. So when I say add a moat, I'm not actually referring to a water-filled moat, I'm referring to a dry moat. A big ditch, and you would want to fill it with spikes at the bottom. Looking at some of the closer shots of the castle walls, I personally feel that the height of these walls are far too low. I think this is actually due to budget restrictions, and it will certainly do the job that you want, but here we come into that issue I was saying with the matriculations that are present. First of all, the matriculations are not present on all of the castle walls, and on top of this, the crenellations, which are actually even more essential than matriculations, are also not present around the entire wall of Winterfell. I first criticized Winterfell for having a lack of crenellations from the first shots we see in Season 1. We only see small little kind of gaps and crevices periodically along these walls, like they had eroded away. Well, crenellations seem to have been added to Winterfell, and perhaps they were added after the sacking of Winterfell, and much of it needed to be rebuilt, but the thing is, only the wooden parts of Winterfell burnt, but perhaps when they were rebuilding the wooden parts, they felt, well, we can at least upgrade the parts around the gatehouses to have proper crenellations, proper defenses. But the issue is, if you don't have proper crenellations around the entire wall of your castle, any besieger with any brains at all would notice, oh, look at these areas without proper crenellations. Well, let's attack the castle from that direction, from that side of the castle, which is far less defended. And because there's no moat, it's so easy to approach it with siege towers, ladder rushes, and all that stuff. We can just avoid one of the most fortified parts of this castle, the gatehouses, and just take it from the side. You see, the whole point about fortifying the main entrance is to force the besiegers to approach the castle from that entrance. Make getting over the walls so difficult to near impossible from any other direction that the best course of action for the besiegers is to batter down the front door, which funnels them in right in between these two flanking towers at the gatehouse, and you can just destroy anyone trying to attack them. Oh, and by the way, there's matriculations on the walls, but there's no matriculations above the actual gate entrance on the gatehouse? What? You would usually want matriculations above the main entrance specifically, because on proper castle design, that is the main area in which the besieger would want to try and attack from, because every other approach is just suicide. The problem with Winterfell is that there are so many other approaches that are so much better than trying to go for the main gate. It's a big flaw in its design. But we see this historically. Interestingly enough, matriculations were a far more prominent feature on French castles. We see a distinct lack of matriculations on English castles. But when English castles did have matriculations, it was usually above the main entrance, the gatehouse. And so the most primary location based on traditional real historical castle design where you would put matriculations on a castle is absent on Winterfell. They have matriculations on the other less important part, the most important part where you'd want to put them. Because remember, on a standard castle wall, there's no guarantee that the besiegers would approach that castle wall and get adjacent to the wall to actually create the necessity and advantage of matriculations above. That's what they're for, shooting down at people adjacent to the wall. And so out of any part on the castle, the part where you can be most assured that people will be getting very close to the bottom of the castle wall is the gate, because they're going to try and knock down that gate door, and also the portcullis, which means matriculations are so important above that area. Another odd thing about the design of the matriculations is the distance between the crenellations and matriculations. The matriculations are almost an entire kind of floor away from the crenellations above, making them very, very low. Oh, and by the way, the matriculations weren't employed in the defense of Winterfell during the One Night at all, which would have been really useful. But anyway, because the castle wall is already too low in my opinion, having the matriculations extended so far away from the crenellations above makes them far too close to the ground, lessening their effectiveness if you ever use them. Now this type of design, not talking about how low they are to the ground level, but the separation, the distance you have between the matriculations and the crenellations can be done. It just means you need an intermediate rampart in between. There would be like a hallway underneath the main rampart at the very top where the the battlements are, where you would have another line of defenders manning the matriculations. The problem with it, though, is that the people trying to man the matriculations wouldn't be able to shoot forward very far. They would only be able to shoot down at the wall, and they can't switch to shooting between the crenellations because there is a stone wall in front of them. There is a big separation here. So the way to make these matriculations far better is if there were arrow loops accompanying the matriculations, which would sit underneath the main rampart above, the crenellations above, and that means the people manning the matriculations will also be able to shoot forward instead of just down. But on Winterfell, no, completely sealed off. So another design fail. Another note on these open roof towers. One of the reasons why I would assume they would have an open roof on them, because they have the provision there to complete the roof and fully seal it off to give people shelter, whoever, I mean, you could just add more rooms, and more rooms are very useful on castles. But to keep them open, I would have assumed this would be to put trebuchets on the towers to enable some counter-siege weaponry. But as we did see in the Long Night, the Battle of Winterfell, they had trebuchets, but they weren't atop the towers. They were outside the castle. And not only were they outside the castle, they were in front of the army and infantry. If you want to know all my criticisms of the Battle of Winterfell, the Long Night, I've got a dedicated video for you. Now, regarding the internal layout of Winterfell, it's a bit of a mess, but that isn't necessarily a bad thing. It seems like they've just put structures wherever they could fit them, and that the overall population inside Winterfell was quite high. And if that's the case, you're going to need a lot of buildings, and you just put them where you can. But what does seem good about this, it does look like there are internal divisions inside the first outer wall, or the curtain wall. This means that if the outer curtain wall was ever taken or breached, and the enemy besiegers are able to get inside the bailey, they haven't taken the whole castle. The defenders inside the castle can fall back to another defensive position and hold the line there. And with internal divisions like this, you can actually create kill zones inside your own castle layout, where the enemy, when they breach one area, they get trapped in this new area, and if you have archers and defenders on the fallback positions and even towers that haven't been breached, that are near the area where the breach was, you can just rain down death upon anyone who's inside. Now, on the note of what you can employ in raining down death, well, of course, there's arrow fire and rocks. Then people assume boiling oil. Oil is an expensive resource. You would actually use boiling water or boiled sand. When I say boiled sand, not melted sand, but sand heated up really, really hot. Inexpensive resources that can be employed because you're just throwing them away, and it would cause horrendous pain on any defenders. There is a primary central tower inside Winterfell that I think we can identify as the main keep. Though, having said that, there is this square kind of fortified tower next to it, yet still the most prominent, largest fortified building is what we would kind of call the keep. It has an interesting design, and my only criticism with it is the roofline, but separate to the roofline, it's actually perfectly consistent with this world. It's a fantasy world, and it has kind of a medieval aesthetic with the technology level you would expect within a medieval setting. It's very visually iconic, which is kind of the thing that you want. There is a very odd part in this design, which is just next to this larger keep. It's these larger kind of raised blocky sections. Now, I'm a bit confused whether these larger blocky sections are actual buildings, okay, there are rooms inside, or if they're actually kind of retaining walls to either an earthwork, which is like packed dirt, packed stone, or even just there was a rocky kind of hill here that they carved out and then built in a stone wall around it. This would be the more realistic design if it's the case, because on top of these block sections are two separate towers. One tower is a very interesting design, which actually breaks a bit from the overall aesthetic of Winterfell. It kind of stands out like a sore thumb. It's very different. It adds a bit of visual flavor, and these side kind of sections on each corner are like buttressing, which is a medieval architectural design. I just kind of feel it could have been made to match the rest of the architecture of Winterfell. And the other tower is just a round tower with the Winterfell style crenellations atop. If the block sections they're sitting on are not actually made out of packed dirt or rock, what is holding them up? If they're just sitting on the roof of another building, that means the supports of these towers would have to run through the inside of the structures underneath, which is very odd and rarely ever happened historically because it's hugely inefficient. But if they have a proper foundation and these block sections are just walls around dirt and rock, well, that's perfectly fine, and they give these towers a much higher elevation. In actual fact, on the tower that has real battlements atop of it, we see two lines of defense because of this, which means you can add 2 defensive lines of defenders atop them, and anyone who breaches the outer curtain wall and gets stuck there will be fired upon from 2 defensive walls. There are some other odd things about Winterfell, and it's the placement of the towers themselves. For instance, look here. There are 2 circular towers placed side by side to one another. That's a waste. If you wanted additional fortified platforms for this section of the castle, you could have added just external platforms like hoardings, just a bit underneath the main stone fortifications atop, or make the circumference of the tower a little bit larger, or run a wall around the outside of this tower as well. Having 2 towers side by side is just nonsensical and a waste of resources. The only time we have towers so close, not as close as this, but closer, is on gatehouses, when you have 2 towers flanking something very significant like the entrance of your castle. But these towers aren't just close like on gatehouses, they are literally side by side, which is just ridiculous. And we see this in a couple of other places on Winterfell, like from the bird's eye view. Look, 2 towers side by side. There is a tower very close to this tower over here. It's almost like the designers of Winterfell didn't know too much about effective castle design and just spewed in as many castle-like elements as they could to fill it all up, to make it all kind of visually diverse in this sense, which to someone who's not really familiar with authentic castle design, oh, well, there's a lot of castle there, that looks very castle-y, it's cool. But from a defensive analysis, it's quite nonsensical. If we have a look at the outer wall again, we see some areas on the wall that really should have towers on them, specifically when there is an outside angle or curve to the wall. Towers increase your field of fire, so there are no blind spots where a besieger can kind of hide behind any defender's line of fire. For instance, if any besiegers attacked Winterfell from this direction here and got right close adjacent to the castle wall here, they almost have complete cover if no one's fully in this tower. There's no real crenellations above for defenders to shoot down on anyone so close to the wall. They have to get up above the barrier, because there is a barrier between the rampart and the outer wall, but there's no crenellations in between the barrier. And they'd have to get up, lean up over, exposing themselves to fire anyone down adjacent to the castle wall here, and they have complete cover from this larger crenellated tower off to its side. This kind of, circular tower, it's a hoarding, so there would be openings for defenders to shoot through and stuff, but that means the besiegers only have 1 tower to really worry about. If there was an additional tower on this corner of wall, that means they are sandwiched in between 2 towers. So there should be a tower here, there should be a tower here on the right side of the gatehouse from what we're looking at. Every point where the wall has an outwards angle, not an inwards angle like we see on this corner, but an outwards angle, there should be a tower. And on Winterfell, there are some areas where they're simply not. That's not good. They did a fairly good job on the wall that's encircling the Godswood. A tower on most points where the wall has an angle on, though having said that, there is a part on the wall where both towers on this left side would lose their field of fire. They would not be able to angle into anyone adjacent to the wall over here. Again, a flaw in this castle's layout. So overall, the design of Winterfell is actually fairly poor. There are a lot of just bad elements to it. The lack of the moat is the biggest one. If you had a moat to it, and crenellations around the entire wall, not just the front gate parts, and avoid having these huge defensive weaknesses on the castle design, the castle would be far more functional and defensible, because right now, if I was besieging this castle, I'd be like, well, just attack it from the right side here. It's got barely any crenellations, poorly defended. We could easily take that part of the bailey, and look, we would then need to try and deal with the internal keep and structures, which are fairly well fortified, but you wouldn't want the besiegers to get even that far. You don't want them to breach the outer wall, because once they breach the outer wall, well, they have kind of a staging platform to try and take the rest of the castle. So yes, Winterfell, very poor. I do like the design aesthetic they went with. If it was just employed in a more functional castle design layout, much better. So there we go. This has been my in-depth analysis. I hope you've enjoyed. Thank you for watching. And of course, I hope to see you again. So until that time,